It's a wonderful Friday morning, and you are most welcome again to our Shifting Blame series. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Estella Hilda Anneman, and I'm the coordinator for American Corner Abuba. I'll be your moderator for this session. American Spaces provides access to current and reliable information about the United States through book collections, internet access, events, and activities for everyone. So today is International Women's Day, and on this day, we want to take a moment to celebrate the strength, the resilience, and achievements of women everywhere. And as we are celebrating these achievements of women worldwide, we also want to invest time to reflect on the challenges that persist, particularly concerning gender-based violence. So over the next hour, we are going to explore the roles of communities in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. Facilitating this session is our esteemed speaker, Ms. Gina America. So she is a communication specialist and a founder of Alma Africa. So Ms. Gina America is a communication consultant and a policy analyst with over 10 years experience in corporate communications and public administration. So Ms. America is a youth sounding board member of UNDP Ghana and a PhD student at the Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. So she founded Alma Africa, an NGO which advocates for girl-child education and women empowerment across Africa. In the past 4 years, Alma Africa has collaborated with other NGOs in Africa to implement projects on gender-based violence in 6 African countries, including Nigeria, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Benin, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. She's also the founder of MCP Services Ghana, a communications consultancy, providing consultancy services with special focus on foreign companies seeking to invest in the Ghanaian economy, leveraging on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. She has a master's degree in communications and a bachelor's degree in development management, and she's also an alumni of the Mandela Washington Fellowship 2022 cohort. So throughout the session, we encourage you all to actively participate, ask your questions, and share your perspectives in the comment box below, and they'll be well addressed. So thank you so much for staying with us. And now I'll hand it over to Ms. Gina.
Thank you, Estella, for that very esteemed introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here, and especially on this very special occasion. Today happens to be a very special day for all women across the globe. It's a day to, as you rightfully mentioned, celebrate the resilience of women. Today is marking the International Women's Day, and I would like to use this opportunity to celebrate all women who have been resilient across various sectors. This year's celebration is themed Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress. It brings to mind the very known quote from Kweju Agri, which says that if you educate a man, you educate an individual, but if you educate a woman, you educate a whole nation. This only highlights the ripple effects, the very positive ripple effect in investing in women. And as we mark this very august occasion, it is my hope that the governments, various civic societies who are poised to invest in women continue to do their very best in this field to ensure that we fight for the development of women as much as we have already been doing, to sustainably build the very economically empowered women that we hope to see on the African continent. In line with this year's celebration, we will be discussing the role of communities in preventing and responding to gender-based violence. To be able to ascertain the role of communities in responding and preventing gender-based violence, it is important to first understand or just again, give ourselves a refresher of what gender-based violence is all about. According to the European Union, gender-based violence is violence, any form of violence at all directed against a person because of the person's gender, or violence that affects particular gender disproportionately. It is also important to note that women are more vulnerable when it comes to gender-based violence. In terms of the occurrence of gender-based violence, it often occurs in specific units, either within the family, the domestic units, meaning not necessarily family members living within that particular domestic setting, and the most prevalent being among the intimate partners, which is dubbed the intimate partner violence. In terms of the prevalence of gender-based violence on the African continent, currently, the prevalence rate of gender-based violence among women on the African continent stands at 30.58%, which is quite staggering. And the most popular form of gender-based violence, being the intimate partner violence, stands at 35.5%, which indicates that majority of cases reported are among intimate partners, and with the prevalence rate among non-intimate partners standing at 14%. And these statistics were derived from research organized by Mulune et al. In 2020. Now, bringing it home to Ghana in terms of the prevalence, 31% of women in Ghana experience gender-based violence, according to the Domestic Violence Victim Support Unit, as against 3.4% of reported cases against men, according to the DAI in 2020. As I mentioned earlier on, women are more vulnerable when it comes to gender-based violence, and these statistics prove that. When it comes to intimate partner violence in Ghana, the statistic stands at 24.4%, which is also quite staggering. So this is the percentage of couple violence that happens among intimate partners or couples. And it brings to mind a lot in terms of factors that could possibly be driving this high prevalence rate of gender-based violence in the country. It's important to also highlight the forms in which these forms of violence occur. On the African continent, 4 forms of violence are prevalent: the sexual, physical, economic, and the emotional. Currently, the sexual forms of gender-based violence stands at 18.75%, with the physical forms of violence being pegged at 25.87%, and economic forms of violence being estimated to stand at 23%, and emotional forms of violence surprisingly being the highest at 29.40%, according to Molina et al. And Kanogia et al. Now, to the factors that serve as drivers of gender-based violence on the African continent. The social factors being the social settings that we have and the social beliefs that drives our activities within our settings, such as a man being the head of the household, a woman's place being in the kitchen. All of these social nuances are known to be drivers of gender-based violence on the African continent. Another key driver of gender-based violence on the continent are the cultural norms, beliefs, and practices that exist on the African continent and also in Ghana. Chief amongst them will be the female genital mutilation as stipulated in the pictures you're seeing, and child marriages, the widowhood rights, and other cultural practices that seeks to demean and denigrates women. All of these cultural practices serve as very key drivers of gender-based violence on the continent. Another key driver being the economic factor, where women, statistically, women are less economically empowered on the African continent. We have fewer women in the workforce, and even the women in the workforce earn less compared to their male counterparts. And this leads to a very imbalanced economic situation, whether be it in a domestic setting or a social setting. The fact that we have a larger population of women who are unemployed, either formally or informally, leaves a lot of women economically dependent on men. And this economic dependence also is seen as a key driver of gender-based violence. Today we'll be discussing, or we will be focusing a lot more on the role of the community in responding and preventing gender-based violence in Ghana and on the continent at large. To be able to understand this, or to be able to discuss, important to define what I mean by a community. The textual or the dictionary definition of a community will be perhaps a group of people living within a particular geographical setting, or a group of people who are bound by similar interests or beliefs. All of these are right and well within the frameworks. So my definition of a community, or to contextualize what we mean by a community in this presentation, we mean the family setting, which happens to be the first form of socialization for any individual. The very institutional structures we have in our society, be it the religious organizations, the traditional entities, the educational institutions, all institutions that serves as a harbor for women to get together, for groups of women to get together for one thing or another. Also, our geographical settings serves as a place, a communal setting where women identify or group or are able to commune or interact with each other. Our social settings as well, our group of friends, our camaraderie. All of these integral subgroups are part of my definition of a community. So I would want you to look beyond just the normal local geographical setting, local settings definition of community. When I say community, it goes beyond the local setting. I'm talking about even individual friendships, individual social settings, individual institutions that exist within our socio-cultural context on the African continent and in Ghana as a community. Why are communities important? Communities are important because they build spaces for women to fellowship and build companionship. They also serve as avenues for women to engage and learn, or for women to embark on projects or embark on initiatives that interest them, or to learn a thing or two. This makes communities not only an important avenue for women's psychosocial support, but becomes a very integral force in collective action. So in order to be able to have a sustainable impact in terms of curtailing gender-based violence, it is important to drive advocacy through all of these communal frameworks in order to have the needed response. Now, to the role of the community in response to gender-based violence, it is important for the community to build or create a safe space for refuge. One can actually argue that the community, either be it the religious-based organizations or the traditional settings or the geographical settings, are the first points of call when any woman should experience any form of violence. They may choose to confide in their religious authorities or their traditional authorities or their community leaders or their various social settings. But to confide in someone first always has to be a person within a community or within the community as described. And it's important for these communities to be safe spaces and safe havens for women to freely open up and share their stories. Otherwise, what would happen will be women holding on to their abuses, not speaking about them, and which also would bring about other effects that can be curtailed. It's also important for women or these communities to serve as emotional and psychosocial support units. Aside from just opening up, it is important for the community to serve as a certain form of companionship for these survivors, which is very important in the recovery process. It is also very important for the communities to serve as a point of education and support in seeking legal redress. More often than not, given the very traditional and local settings that we have on the continent and in Ghana, some communities tend to want to address issues of gender-based violence in an informal manner, where families will sit and perhaps try to admonish the perpetrator. But this does nothing. It does not solve the problem in any way. It only emboldens the perpetrator to go and repeat the act. Because, well, of course, the repercussions of his actions will not be felt. So it is important for these communities to rather support in the seeking of legal redress, which would disempower future perpetrators from embarking on various acts of gender-based violence. It is also important in responding for communities to take up very integral advocacy roles to educate their community members, whether in the faith-based organizations, whether it be the local geographical settings or within friends, however informal or formal, to advocate on the dangers of gender-based violence and to encourage victims to speak up and seek the needed support. It is also important for communities to collaborate on intervention and prevention. This is seen in some settings where some civic organizations are able to partner with some faith-based organizations during certain celebrations to talk about issues related to women. Also during days like this, during the International Celebration of International Women's Day, certain community discussions are had across board. All of these are important steps within communities to try to curtail and educate women on the effects of gender-based violence in the community at large. And on to the role of community in the prevention of gender-based violence, the empowerment of women is very critical and crucial, because an empowered woman is a step miles away from a woman who can possibly have her rights violated. Empowerment, not only in terms of knowing one's rights, but empowerment economically, empowerment across various spheres. And we see this sometimes in certain communities where women are encouraged or enhanced with certain informal economic skills such as soap making, dressmaking, education. All of these are very, very good avenues to empower women to be able to escape some of the dangers or some of the factors, be it economic factors, sexual factors that tend to be drivers of gender-based violence. Another key role of the community in preventing gender-based violence will be to educate, engage, and advocate. So educate and engage individuals on the effects of gender-based violence, not just women, but both sexes, and especially at a young age. It's important to start young. It's important to start in schools so that some of these habits are changed Some of these kids may be already oriented within their domestic settings, but as some of these educations start quite early, it helps in unlearning some of these activities. So it's important for the various communities to engage in education and advocacy across board. It's also important in the preventive activities to educate on legal frameworks for redresses. As I mentioned, these communities might usually tend to address issues very informally, especially within the family unit. I know someone, based on my own experience, someone really close to me who was raped by a known family friend. She was just in high school at the time, in her third year, was home on vacation. Her parents had traveled, and this is a very known family friend. Her father's friend spiked her drink. Before she knew it, she had been raped. She went back to school only to find out that she went back to school when the school reopened, only to find out that she was pregnant in the boarding house, which was as a result of this rape, of her being raped. She reported to the family. She identified the gentleman as the perpetrator. The family only sat down with the gentleman, and he was made to pay an amount of, was it about 2,000 cedis with a bottle of schnapp. It was really a painful experience. And I remember encouraging her mom, her parents to report this, but they were of the view that they didn't want to smear the family name. They didn't want any form of embarrassment. So she was hidden throughout the period of the pregnancy. She was complete. Nobody had access to her. Nobody knew where she was until she put to birth. When she put to birth, she didn't want to do anything to do with the child because of the trauma. And because of the anger she felt, and she felt that her parents did not advocate for her enough, her parents didn't support her enough, or didn't stand for her enough. And of course, I still don't know where she is. She's completely cut everybody off, just gave the baby to her family. She didn't want anything to do with the baby. And we don't know where she is. So some of these, even though the families try to deal with these issues informally, it does not satisfy or completely deal with a traumatic experience the survivor, has to deal with for the rest of her life. And neither does it, neither does it measure up to the punitive measures that the perpetrator deserves. Across board, nothing is solved if it's only dealt with informally. So it is important to educate on the legal frameworks, important for these communities to seek to deal with perpetrators or through the legal means, and also learn to provide or to introduce survivors to very professional help, which would rather go a long way. Another key preventive measure will be holding of known offenders accountable. As I mentioned earlier on, it's easy for these communities to try to deal with issues informally, but it's important for communities to hold known offenders accountable to the fullest measure of the law, because anything outside of the legal redress will only lead to emboldening the perpetrator to continue in the act. It's also important for our communities to collectively shape new gender norms, for us to learn to unlearn, learn to unlearn some of the known cultural gender norms and the known gender rhetorics, such as, a woman's place is in the kitchen, the man can go as far as he can go. I remember when I signed up for my PhD course, someone who was very close to me, more like a mentor to me, just said, no, you're already very outspoken. If you go ahead and do your PhD, no man will marry you. And I sat back surprised, that this woman has achieved everything that I want to achieve. And yes, still some of these cultural, whether biased or implicit some of these very implicit biases still exist within our communities. We have to collectively within our communities unlearn some of these rhetorics. What happens in Ghana's case? As it stands in Ghana, within the communities try as much as possible to empower women. We've seen several informal activities within their respective, perhaps faith-based organizations, schools, to enhance women's skills, to empower women with economic abilities, however informal, being soap making or teaching women new IT skills, dressmaking. All of these are efforts to build up women within these respective communities. And the more they're built up, the less they are vulnerable to any form of violence at all. We've seen also in our cultural setting in Ghana, within the communities, that it serves as an avenue for advocacy among civic organizations. We've seen this happen in our churches, our mosques, within our communities, where civic organizations collaborate with respective faith-based organizations to educate on various rights of women and issues that borders around women empowerment generally. And today being International Women's Day, there are lots of activities that I believe would take place in the respective communities in the local geographical settings within the country, which are all geared towards empowering women and also enhancing the knowledge of women, especially within the activity and the phenomena of gender-based violence. In Ghana as well, these communities tend to, within our local settings, be the first point of call should anything happen. People in Ghana are usually more likely to talk to their families, their friends, their religious authorities, or people within the local geographical settings about this predicament before even attending or before even turning to seek legal redresses. And also, these communities within our settings tend to provide emotional and psychosocial support to victims. But what has been some of the lags that we've experienced with communities in Ghana so far? Victim shaming and victim blaming. I shared a story about a young lady that I know who's just been raped. And I remember when this issue came to light, a known family member just said, well, what were you wearing on that day? And I was so surprised. I said, what she was wearing has nothing to do with the situation. She was in her home. And he came to visit somebody that was not around when it happened. So what she was wearing was very inconsequential. She was home. But this victim blaming, this victim shaming happens within our communities. And this serves as a deterrent to women coming forward to report various forms of gender-based violence, especially sexual violence. We've seen this has been argued across various boards. When you look at the statistics of the prevalence of gender-based violence, you realize that the sexual violence is usually very low. And there are two schools of thought. There are some schools of thought that argue that women, it's statistically low because women do not often report when they're sexually violated, because they don't want to be shamed or blamed, and they do not want to carry that societal burden of people, having that hang over their heads, with people bringing that up consistently. And there are other schools of thought who argue that it's perhaps because maybe the sexual violence is not as prevalent as the other forms of violence, but definitely victim shaming and blaming would or does play a crucial role in deterring the reporting of various forms of gender-based violence. Another lag within our communities has to do with the prescription or prescribing harmful gender roles. The man, the woman's place is in the kitchen, or the boy can go as far as he can go. All of these harmful gender roles, most of it happens to be very implicit at this point and very culturally induced, but it still exists and their effects are felt. So it's important to be able to address and unlearn them. Other lags also are the possibilities of the issues being dealt with in a local setting without seeking legal redress. I've talked about that extensively. Also, the inability to provide professional assistance is a very key lag within our society, where professional assistance, especially in the space of psychosocial support for survivors, where we just assume that once you cry over it and you stop crying, you're okay. But what we don't realize is that the trauma lingers. And if once a trauma is undealt with, it does affect other aspects of the individual's life. So it's important to be able to introduce or put forth the importance of professional help, especially in the space of psychosocial support. The non-discretion in most of our communities is also a very key lag, where individuals put out information that survivors have trusted them with, and these are all deterrents to women owning up or opening up to their experiences and seeking the needed help. What is the way forward, or what can we do as a community? As a community, it's important to continue or increase outreach and education across board. That is being done in Ghana, as I know, to a large extent within our communities. We tend to advocate from time to time, but it's important to do that and do that on a larger scale, because not just do that on a larger scale, but be able to do that across board among both genders. In terms of community mobilization, it's important to whip up participation also across board. Often when it comes to issues related to women, dealing or advocating for these issues are relegated to women. But it's important to mobilize participation among both sexes in order to bring forth the severity of the problem. It's easier for a man to understand issues when it's being solved by another man, or when men are talking to men. So it's important to be able to close that gap and enforce participation among both genders. Also, communities organizing these forms of outreaches and very spontaneous, maybe perhaps once in a year during the Women's Week, week celebration, or International Women's Day celebration, or Women's Week celebration in church, or maybe a community festival celebration. But in order to get the needed sustainable effects of curtailing gender-based violence, these outreaches have to be very organized and strategic and very consistent. So we don't just have to organize these events sporadically, or only when there's something, a yearly celebration, but we have to be strategic within the respective communities, churches, mosques, the traditional setting, the local settings, the community leaders. There has to be a strategic effort to educate, a conscious effort to educate consistently on the vices of gender-based violence that we're expecting to see. Communities will also have to be forthcoming in terms of building support systems. The support systems have to be conscious. It's important for community leaders or the respective communities to be aware of the legal channels that exist, to be aware of the support systems that exist in the country in order to educate their members. But most importantly, it is very integral for these communities to also serve as the support systems where they can be confided in, individual leaders can be confided in, and the trust that that survivor opening up will receive the needed support within that sphere. It's also important for communities to hold perpetrators accountable. And this accountability should not only come from an informal admonishment, but from a legal standpoint. Not only would it serve as a deterrence on the part of the perpetrator, but also serves as a clear indication to other potential perpetrators that their actions will be held accountable. And this, will culminate to a certain degree, or, this will, enhance comprehensively to the curtailing of gender-based violence across board. In conclusion, our communities play an integral role on the continent and in Ghana. Whichever country you live in on the continent, these structures that exist within our communities are not far removed from you, or they're not different from the sociocultural settings that exist within your setting, which is why in order to be able to have any sustainable change in the development of women, and in this case, especially towards curtailing gender-based violence, it is important to make use of these communities as drivers of the change, to send out messages not only through education or advocacy, but also to charge these communities in holding the perpetrators accountable and supporting survivors of gender-based violence, and also being that refuge, being that very wholesome refuge for survivors of gender-based violence. Only then will we begin to see a certain level of sustainable change in the narrative or the phenomenon of gender-based violence on the African continent. I leave you with, a charge, really, that we as civic organizations and other private entities advocating against gender-based violence, to make good use of the communities and the structures that exist. They, however informal, are very instrumental in sending or delivering the message and education we need in curtailing this particular phenomenon to the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you so much for those valuable insights you've shared with us today. So yes, so to our Q&A, please drop your questions in the chat box, and Ms. Gina will address them accordingly. And so I want to, the first question that we are looking at is the place of the community at the level of families. Now, when we come to the family setting, usually there's a lot of emotional attachment here and there. For instance, if a child witnesses a father hitting the mom, and in the place of holding the perpetrator accountable, how does that child manage all those things at the same time? What is that safe haven for that child to voice out what he or she saw, and then make sure that they are not feeling too guilty that they reported their dad, or something in that sense? How do we address that issue with regards to children or eyewitnesses of gender-based violence in the community?
Yeah, thank you, Esther. That's a loaded question. The issue with children being oriented at a very early stage and witnessing various forms of violence has very dire implications. Excuse me, because statistics show that children who are exposed to any form of violence tend to be offenders themselves as they grow up. So it's a very complex issue. And then there's also that aspect you mentioned where there's the guilt aspect you mentioned, where you feel guilty about reporting your parents, or you're afraid that they're going to get taken away from you. And there's that cultural, subtle cultural expectation also that a child doesn't meddle in an adult's in business, or in an adult's business, or in adults' conversations, or issues that is related to grown-ups or adults or their parents. So all of these, puts young or children in Ghana and generally the African continent in a very peculiar and complex place when it comes to dealing with gender-based violence and issues that they've seen. In addressing them, it's important for children. Children will most likely feel comfortable speaking to somebody they trust. And in this case, if it's not their parents, it perhaps could be their teacher or a community leader or a neighbor, or somebody they trust. The right thing to do, if anybody within the community is confided in, would be to seek, first of all, make sure the child is okay. Seek a certain support for that child and make sure that the child is okay. And then address the issue from a parent's perspective. And also make sure that there's a legal aspect to it. It's a very complex line that has to be told in a very fine way. Because there's that aspect where the child comes home and could be subjected to violence themselves because they might have exposed something happening within the family unit. So whoever the child speaks to has to make sure that there's that protection for the child first by making sure they're okay and making sure that there aren't any fiscal repercussions, and draw the parental attention. Aside from drawing parental attention as well, seeking that the next step, what needs to be done in protecting the vulnerable parents and reporting the parent who is the perpetrator, in all of this. But it always has to be addressed from beginning, or the child always has to be the starting point of trying to deal with something like that. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did, but this is a very complex, it's just very similar to a woman who's been physically or being assaulted in a relationship, but is not economically empowered, has children, is afraid to leave because one, she's unable to take care of the children or to cater for the children on her own. She's afraid her husband or her partner will be arrested if she reports. And if he's arrested and taken away, she's not economically empowered to take over the household, so she stays. And then the cycle continues without, taking or being cognizant of the effects it has on the children. So if a child can open up to somebody, it's important to open up to somebody they trust. As I said, it's very, very often will be a teacher or a neighbor or somebody they trust. And in dealing with that, the child always has to be put in the forefront in dealing with it. Even though you seek legal redress, the first point of call should always be to make sure the child is okay. And also to make sure that there won't be any fiscal repercussions from the parents who's perpetrating these actions.
Right, thank you so much for that response. But talking about the place of the faith-based community, how do you think that the faith-based community can be positioned in a place where they can also address these issues of gender-based violence in their?
Hello, Estella.
Hi, Gina.
Yes. In response, I think that the faith-based organizations in Ghana, I'm not so familiar with what happens in other parts of Africa, but in Ghana, the faith-based organizations and churches try to use their pulpits, and when these issues arise, often church members who speak with their leaders, the issue is called, and from a spiritual standpoint, admonishments are made. But is that enough to curtail the problem or the challenge? I have witnessed that. One of my cousins, the issue was dealt with from a religious standpoint. He did slap her again in front of everybody, in front of the pastors, in front of everyone. I kept saying, report this gentleman, like report him. So even though they're doing their best in terms of using the pulpit and trying to deal with the issue from a spiritual standpoint, it is never enough. Often in the cases of such serious aggressors, it is always important to seek legal redress. And once people are faced with the consequences of their action, especially at the heights where they could be spending time in jail, there could be refrains, or they are often refrained, and I won't say a change of heart, but they are often refrained. So it is important for faith-based organizations to go a step further. How can they situate this to make it more consistent and make it more structured? We do have the Christian councils, or the respective faith-based organizations do have structures. We have the Islamic Council, there's the Christian Council, there's a traditional leaders, and also has their own structure. It's important to be able to ingrain in some of our teachings, practices, be it quarterly or be it yearly or be it perhaps on a monthly basis, education on some of these issues that are very prevalent and that are very problematic in our societies. I would love to see perhaps a Christian council or the Islamic council have, very clear guidelines for the churches as to how to deal with issues related to gender-based violence, that it should go beyond prayers. It should go beyond setting and admonishing from a spiritual standpoint. From now onwards, if any church member or any member of the Islamic community reports their partners for X and X activity, legal action will be taken. Let's add that extra layer from a structural perspective. And I think that would solve the problem. That would go a long way to curtailing the problem than just leaving it open to will, where individual churches out of their own will hold programs spontaneously in and out of season. But when it comes from a very structural perspective, like from the Christian Council, all that, saying that this from henceforth is how we're going to deal with issues with regards to gender-based violence, I think that will have a more sustainable approach.
Well said. Yeah, that's really great to have. It's great to have that response as well. And so we have a question from Richard Azai. He's asking, do you think that poverty is the cause of preventing and responding to gender-based violence? And then he also asks that, should we also educate the community on skills acquisition for solutions on this?
Yes. Thank you for the question, Richard. I think that, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, economic disempowerment plays a crucial role in the prevalence of gender-based violence. And poverty, as I did mention, could be a very strong motivation or demotivating factor in reporting issues related to gender-based violence. I did cite an example of perhaps a woman who has no economic empowerment, whose husband continues to abuse her. She has about 3 or 4 kids with no way of supporting them on her own. She is very unlikely to report her husband for his actions, for the fear of him being taken away, and also for the fear of being left in a very disempowered position where she's unable to support her family. So poverty plays a huge role, and poverty, especially with regards to the very economically disempowered populace in terms of women who have no forms of skill set or economic empowerment. And then what's the follow-up question?
Should we also educate the community on skills acquisition for solutions on this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that educating the community, that there should never be a limit or a cap to information that should go out there. Skills acquisition, I did mention formal and informal. Any form of economic activity or empowerment activity that seeks to enhance a woman's ability to provide for herself should always be on the table. I've lauded the faith-based organizations and communities' activities in empowering women, usually in the very informal, with some informal skills in soap making, dressmaking, and all of these activities, just to build and upskill women and to give women some form of livelihood, an opportunity for a livelihood, alternative livelihood schemes. These are very important in building women. I think that the more empowered, even statistics shows that the more empowered women are, the more educated they are about issues related to gender-based violence, or the more informed they are, the less likely they are to fall or to be vulnerable or to be victims of gender-based violence. And more so, the more economically empowered they are, the less likely they are to be in a situation like this that continues to persist. Not to say that there aren't economically empowered women who are not experiencing gender-based violence or have experienced gender-based violence, but there's the likelihood of a woman being able to walk out of an abusive relationship when she's economically empowered.
Okay, we have more questions coming in. We have this from Yao. He's asking, how do you encourage victims to pay for legal fee as we push for legal actions against perpetrators?
How do we
encourage victims to pay for legal fee yes.
Yeah, so this is this is another serious lag, and thank you, Yao, for the question. I did remember a year ago or 2 years ago where some students were allegedly sodomized by their teacher. And on the news, I was furious because they sought legal action and they needed to present a medical report and they had to pay for it. They didn't have the money to. So it took the member of parliament for the area to fund it. Some of these challenges also serves as a deterrent for most survivors to seek the legal redress or to go the legal route. Where there aren't clear support within the legal system, I think that there should be a support scheme for survivors of domestic violence, where once some of these reports are made, some cases are taken on pro bono, or we have state prosecutors that lead the legal action, and the medical bills or the bills for medical checkups and all of that are absorbed, especially for individuals within the low income frame, because it becomes very problematic when you are seeking refuge from the law and you have to pay with no form of empowerment to do so. You are most likely to take a step back and to withdraw and not to pursue the case any further. So Yao's question really raises a very important point, which is the fact that we do not have very strong support systems within the legal framework for individual survivors who may not have the financial ability to seek legal redresses, which should be looked at, in fact.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that response, and thank you for that question as well. So I think that it's up for everyone who is a stakeholder to take a look into this and look at how we can help and support these women or people who are going through these issues to get a place to, fall back on. So the next question, which is our last question because we just have to wrap up, is, this is from Bright, is asking that what are some of the measures that is right for a concerned person to report these incidents, and what would it be appropriate to report to your dad or mom if you're a victim of this?
It's appropriate to report anyone if you are a victim. It is appropriate to report anyone if you have been violated in any shape or form. Again, I do understand the fear that exists within our communities, because usually when these reports are made, we do not have a lot of social supports, a social system that supports women or supports individual survivors. In certain spaces, like the US, for example, you can, when you report an aggressive partner, housing is made available for you to make sure that you do not go back or you don't stay within the same setting with the abuser. Your housing is funded, you are giving money for transportation, or you're giving money for a certain level of upkeep if you're not economically empowered. Sadly, we don't have such structures in Ghana. So a child or a spouse reporting their parents or their intimate partner without any form of economic cushion would think twice, or would perhaps be slow to do so, even though they should do it. And you asked also, what are the mechanisms? You start with the police. The Ghana Police Service does have a particular arm that's dedicated solely towards addressing issues of domestic violence or gender-based violence, which happens to be the Domestic Violence Victim Support Units, DOVSU, as we know. So, and now I think as of 2 or 3 years ago, the agenda courts set up, I think one in Kumasi and one in one of the other towns, to fast track issues related to gender-based violence. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of progress in the legal framework. A lot still needs to be done, but there's been a lot of progress. So you start with the Ghana Police Force, and of course, they will be able to assist you from there. There's also social welfare, but social welfare will deal a lot with kids and all of that. But Ghana Police Service, of course, with referral to DOVSU would be on. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I mean, the conversation is getting interesting, but we just have like 2 minutes to go. So thank you so much to you, Ms. Gina, for your expertise and guidance, which has really enriched our discussion today. We really, really celebrate you as an amazing woman. And so to all our participants, your engagement has been invaluable. As we conclude, let's carry forward the spirit of today's discussion, advocate for change, and celebrate the strength of women everywhere. And we know that together we can make a really great difference. So before ending today's program, I want you to know more about an amazing online resource that you may find helpful. This is the eLibrary USA. The eLibrary USA is a state-of-the-art digital library with 9 premium electronic databases that include digital newspapers, magazines, journals, videos, and dissertations. Usually this resource is only available to use in person at our American spaces, but with the global pandemic, we are opening up access to this amazing resource. If you are interested, sign up using the link that can be found in the comment section below. This program was proudly brought to you by the U.S. Embassy Ghana, American Corner of Oba, in partnership with Mobile Web Ghana. Thank you so much again, Ms. Gina, for the insightful session. And that concludes our program. Happy International Women's Day, everyone. Please follow us on YouTube, U.S. Embassy Ghana, for more amazing virtual programs. Thank you so much and have an amazing